welcome to another conversation, another episode of Conversation with Dr.Da Silva. This is a show where we bring various different guests to talk about various different topics. The whole vision of this show is to give us little people a voice, and the mission is to engage in conversations that share our passion about whatever we're talking about. And today I have my friend Mike here as our guest. Michael, welcome.
Hey, Shello, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. And what is your topic today?
Well, I am a web-based cartoonist. You called me in here because you found me working behind a desk somewhere.
Yes, I did.
And I would have given anything to escape from that desk, so here we are.
And what is the title of your show today?
I think the title of the show ought to be The Evolution of a Cartoonist.
Okay. So tell me, when were your interest about cartoons?
I mean, when they start?
When did you start?
Well, they've really always been there. I mean, I can't think of a time when I didn't want to be a cartoonist.
Okay.
And back when I was a kid, cartoons were always a very big interest to me. I mean, it starts with Dr. Seuss, obviously. Lots of people latch onto that early on. It's one of my earliest memories was Dr. Seuss books. But as you get older, you move on to bigger stuff. You got the Looney Tunes, you got the Tom and Jerry cartoons. You got, for me, the big thing was Calvin and Hobbes comics, though. You ever read those?
I didn't.
You did not?
I did not. Can you believe it?
I can't believe it.
Can we still be friends, though?
Oh, of course we can.
Okay, just checking.
Okay. That was a big thing when I was young because it was one of the few comics that made me want to read, Because for every comic that was just a visual gag with a dinosaur or a mutated snowman, the writer, Bill Watterson, had a tendency to use more big words that would go over the head of a small child, and most of the time it made me want to read just so I could understand what I was reading.
Interesting.
I wanted to learn. And I think that's something that ought to be encouraged at a young age because people these days can't write. I mean, I spend enough time on internet forums to know that there are people who just don't know how to spell correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Or who think that, grammar is not a big thing online. And I do a lot of my publishing online, so it's a big interest to me. So, yeah.
And after that, Calvin and Hobbes.
Yes, well, after that, a boy of a certain age gets interested in superhero comics. When I was a kid, the big thing was Michael Keaton's Batman. That was
right.
That was the go-to at that time. And, it's fed into today. He just showed up as the Vulture in Spider-Man, so
yes,
that's an ongoing trend in movies now. And there are a lot of kids today who can relate to that because the trend has not stopped. But, as you get older, you do diversify your tastes a little bit. You start moving on to bigger things, like there's a magazine called Heavy Metal, if you've ever read that.
Yes, I've heard of it, yes.
Yes, stars a lot of alternative comics from writers across either America or Europe. And the subject matter is kind of nuts there. There have been a few animated movies about that. They tend to skew towards a more adult audience. For the adult content, violence, sexual content, and adult themes, so a little more mature than anything you could find watching the Avengers. But also during that time I started latching onto web cartooning, which when I started reading them was in its infancy. It was just people posting random comics online. That's grown into to an indie scene all of its own. If you remember the film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World?
No, I don't recall that one.
Some of our viewers might, because that comic started off life as a web cartoon, actually. And, they crossed over into the mainstream, became a big Hollywood production.
I know one day we were talking about, and this is interesting because I learned something from you. You were talking about how, the writing and the comics during the 60s were totally different than what it is now.
They are. Comics reflect the tastes of their time as much as any other art form. After our conversation, I tried to think of an appropriate comparison to help people who might not be into comics as much as I am, to help them understand what it is I'm talking about. And I thought of a good one, This is, when we think about rock music and how
Okay.
it started, think about rock music in the 50s and 60s. You have your Elvis, the Beatles, and you move on to the Rolling Stones, the Who. And then you move on a little later, you get bands like Kiss, you get then you get musicians like Limp Bizkit and such as that.
Mm-hmm.
Comics go through phases like that too, where the tastes change where the style and the writing and everything changes. The style changes to reflect the times, the taste of the times. Very much like that. In the 60s, there was this whole thing with Adam West and his Batman. Now, people accuse that Batman of being corny and not true to life, but frankly, he reflected well of the comics of that time, the camp, the ridiculous situations, and the over-the-top villains. And you go into the 70s, then books like the X-Men started to become more popular because they reflect things like the civil rights movement, which have been going on since the 60s. They really started to pick up steam from that. And I think that has already made it one of the more popular comics franchises out there, because it can relate to anybody, people of different races, religions, economic backgrounds, immigrants, people who feel different can really relate to someone who wakes up one day and has laser eyes.
Right.
They really latch on to the feeling of alienation that comes from anybody who's young. We all deal with that, and comics they put a light on it and they validate it by showing, look, it's okay to be different, because you can be a hero, you can be Wolverine, you can be Cyclops, that sort of thing. And it carried on like that. And through the 80s, I think comics went through a sort of identity crisis. They started deconstructing their mores.
How so?
Well, it was around that time that comics started to take a turn for the dark. That was around the time when an artist named Frank Miller got a hold of Batman, started shifting it away from the Adam West era to more the Tim Burton, Michael Keaton era that we know of today. Frank Miller actually influenced that style very much with his titles The Dark Knight Returns and Batman Year One. These titles took Batman in more of a grounded environment.
Right.
They showed him as an urban crime fighter. It was a little closer to a modern cop drama, the way they deconstructed it. And then it was also Watchmen that came out around the same time. Now, so you may be aware that there was a movie about it some years ago. They're talking about turning it into an HBO series. This comic by writer Alan Moore really takes the idea of a superhero on several different levels and deconstructs it. It takes the all-powerful hero like Dr. Manhattan. You may remember the blue guy from the trailers. And sort of explores his disconnection from humanity as he explores his power more. Or a character like Rorschach, the guy with the shifting face, how his obsession with fighting crime sort of precludes any possibility of normal human interaction. Or retired heroes like Night Owl, who managed to successfully disconnect themselves from that life, but can't function in normal society without it. It shows them as damaged individuals, and unfortunately, it's sort of fed into an entire generation of half-baked superhero plots trying to recapture that magic through nothing but sex and violence. In fact, as I mentioned before about the connection between comics and rock music as a cultural mirror, both mediums have also experienced their share of controversy. Because everyone has talked about how rock music can corrupt the youth and influence suicides or mass murders, shit like that. You probably heard that, right?
Of course.
Right, well, comics experienced something very similar to that back in the 50s. There was actually a child psychologist named Dr. Wortham who wrote a book, Seduction of the Innocent, that basically blamed comic books for everything that was wrong with society's youth. And it carried over into something called the Comics Code, which sort of codified all comics going from then to about around the year 2000 when they started breaking it off. Marvel was actually the one to stop carrying it. Any comic that didn't carry it before then was sort of a bargain bin comic, something that didn't get a lot of attention.
So, Mike, let me ask you this then. So, do you feel like this seems like an interesting situation? You mentioned Mirror. It seems like it's a question that you should ask: what came first, the chicken or the egg? So how each influenced each other. I mean, if this child psychologist felt that the medium was kind of influencing children, and then vice versa, the medium was
influenced by them. You mean?
Exactly.
Well, that's true with any art form. There's always an influence. It draws influence from life and feeds back into it. People take their cues from art. But I don't think it's entirely negative. I mean, I think a lot of people draw a lot of positive influence from comics in terms of how they hold themselves in society. I mean, people look at a man like Superman and his drive to represent the best in humanity. I mean, he was created by a couple of by the children of Jewish immigrants, Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster. Back in the day, he was actually created to reflect their feelings of alienation and powerlessness during the Great Depression. And I think they did that very successfully. And characters like Spider-Man, for instance, he's one of the more popular heroes. He reflects very much the struggle of the everyman. Every young person, every person, period, can put themselves in Spider-Man's shoes. His struggle to find a job, to establish meaningful relationships, have enough money to get the good job.
Right.
Everyone can relate to that. I mean, his mask is basically a blank slate you can put yourself onto. That's why he's been so popular over the years, and why they haven't really let him age very much past the age of 20.
Exactly. It's interesting, the obsession that society has with comics, and it's like you said, the title of your of our show today, the evolution. And it's interesting because many years ago, I'd always go to the midnight showing whenever, like tonight, Thor is coming out, so I'd be there, and it was interesting that I would see people online waiting to watch the midnight show, and there's some people there in their 70s and whatever, and I felt that to be so amazing because these are the people that basically started with the comic books when they came out when they were kids, and here now they get to see it, in a different medium through film, cinematography, and to watch it, those stills come to life, and I would always stay after coming out of the movies and actually take time to speak to them and see how they reacted to it and how they felt about it. And it was really a magical thing. And some of them would come with their grandkids, and to see the generation and to see both of them watching this and being part of it. I found it to be pretty amazing. But the whole aspect of what is about us that connects with a hero. Or I have a friend, or actually a friend Kat. Prior to this, she a lot of times identifies with the villains and said, what she shared with me is villains have more of a chance to be more free in some ways because heroes have to are within a constraint because that's what they're supposed to do. So it was interesting the way she interpreted it and the way she described it, and I would like to have more of your thoughts about that.
Well, the reason we have such a boom in comic movies today is because the fans have grown up. The people who grew up reading about Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy 15, for instance, they're the ones who are old enough now to be running these studios. They're looking back with fond memories and they're thinking, not only how can we capitalize on this, but how can we recapture that magic today? The fans, like I said, the fans have grown up, and now that's how we can have these movies now. As for identifying with the characters, yeah, there is very much a sense of that, especially, I mean, villains have an interesting perspective. I mean, we do want to be the villain because they are more free to act. They're more free to do whatever the hell they want to. And there's no easier reference for this than, say, the Batman villains. Like, think of the Joker. Now, he represents a kind of freedom we all desire. I mean, he has no constraints, no limitations on what he can and would do. And I think a lot of people envy that. We want that sort of freedom in our own lives. We look at things that we deal with our families, our friends, our employers, our employees. You know, we'd all like to just look at them and say, you know, what would you do if I just sort of smacked you right here, kind of a thing. Yeah, it's not a very pleasant impulse, but it's one we all have. And with a character like the Joker, we can explore that feeling for a few minutes every day. And that's the thing that's appealing about villains. And another thing that's good about villains is that, for the most part, they don't really see themselves as the villains. Like, if you take a look at The Dark Knight with Two-Face, you remember him, right?
Yes.
By the end of the film, he didn't really see himself as the villain. He was trying to save Gotham City, as much as the Batman was, and it blew up in his face. And even though he knew he'd crossed a line by the end, he saw himself as justified because he was trying to do the right thing, and they wouldn't let him. A lot of Batman villains are like that. They want to do whatever the hell they want to do, whether it's right or wrong.
Right.
And Batman's the one standing in their way. They're basically the hero of their own story.
That's interesting. It's an interesting perspective. You said that they're the hero of their own story. And it's interesting, that dichotomy that they have between both. And I remember that line that the Joker said at the end, and what happens when you have an immovable object connect with an unstoppable
force,
right,
versus an immovable object.
Right. And it's interesting, the relationship. And I even saw, I must admit, I went to see the Batman Lego.
Hey, so did I. Don't feel bad about it.
But it was interesting towards the end, and that he was saying, is like, you really can't be you without me. You know, who's Batman without Joker? Would Batman even exist without a character like Joker? And it was interesting, the little dialogue that they had at the end, if you recall. You probably recall it better than I do. And but it's an interesting perspective, because there's always a constant thing throughout literature, throughout the ages and humanity, about the whole thing about the concept of good and evil. I mean, I'm a big Star Wars person, so the whole Jedi thing, the conversation that Anakin had with Lord Sidious, and he said, "What is evil?" Anyway, it depends on your perspective, and and I think a lot of these cartoons and these comics and these films kind of bring that question to the surface, and I think that's interesting in that regards.
Well, yeah, I mean, people in real life can define themselves through their relationships with others, with heroes and villains in particular. With any good story, a hero is only as good as their villain, because from there comes a source of conflict. And without conflict, you have no story, no matter how small the story can be, whether it's two men fighting over the soul of a city, or a dog trying to get, a piece of meat off of a plate. I mean, if you don't have conflict, you don't have a story. Someone wants to get something.
Right.
Now, as to the relationships between a hero and villain, yeah, there's something of that. When I came back before about Bat villains, they're actually a perfect example of this, because, I mean, any Bat villain you look at is a reflection of Batman in and of themselves. Did you realize that?
Now that you're bringing it up, I'm beginning to.
Yeah, because with a character like the Two-Face, you see the dichotomy between the dark side and the light, which Batman has. With the Joker, there's the push and pull between chaos and order. The Joker is essentially the reflection of Batman. One scowls, the other smiles. And then you look at other characters like
That's interesting.
Yeah. You look at other characters like Mr. Freeze, who mirrors Batman's self-contained nature, how he's cold on the outside, but every act he takes is an act of passion, in his case for his wife, while Batman acts for his parents. Or Poison Ivy, who basically fights for the rights of plants while Batman fights for the rights of men. And you can go up and down the list through all of Batman's enemies. They all reflect him in one way or another.
Wow.
Yeah, you could write a thesis on that alone.
Well, talking about that, the last few minutes here, talk about your project and what you're doing and so on.
Well, my comic is called The Homeroom of Colony High. It's a ongoing story about a school run by alien teachers. It's actually not going to be the end of it there, but I thought that would be a good jumping on point for the story I have in mind. Now, I thought of starting with the school because it was something I felt everyone could relate to.
That is true.
Everyone's been to high school, everyone's been a teenager, and everyone's had a teacher that they thought was a little off, who just couldn't relate to them on some level. Like, you look at this one teacher and go, oh man, what planet is this guy from? I mean, we all have stories like that, don't we? Like,
of course we do.
tell me about any teacher you've had that you could swear was from another planet.
There's one that comes to mind, yes. There's one that comes to mind, yes. So I won't mention that person's name. But yes.
Like Miss X or Mr. X. Or
Right.
Do you want to tell us about them?
I'd rather not at this time.
Okay. But we all do have teachers like that, teachers who we can't relate to because we don't understand where they're coming from. They're trying to do the job of educating us, but we'd rather just not be there. So as far as we're concerned, they might be as well be speaking Pig Latin.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that's something that translates well when you're dealing with an alien teacher because it's the same thing. It's like they're starting off from another planet. They don't get our way of thinking, but they're trying to not only instruct us, but sort of enlighten us to their own way of thinking.
Okay.
And I feel that the more you emphasize on the way these people are different from us, the more you start to realize how different they're not. Because they're people too. They're people with an agenda, people with needs, people with thoughts and ideas that we could actually learn from and help make us better people. And that's one of the themes I was hoping to capitalize on with my comic.
And I think you've done that.
Well, I'm trying to.
What does Yoda say? Do or do not, there is no try. So with that being said, could you please share the name again of your...
My comic is called The Homeroom of Colony High, which you can find at colonyhomeroom.com. Try to pick something simple.
Well, I've watched I've seen it, and I've seen many of his episodes. It's amazing. You have to check it out. The artwork, the message, the creativity is out of this world, and I suggest strongly that you go check it out. All kids of all ages, myself included, should definitely check that out. And Michael, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, thank you very much. And this concludes another episode of Conversation with Dr. Da Silva.